Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate your time. My name is Greg Hall. I'm the Dean of the Herron School of Art and Design. Thank you for joining us this evening, and our thanks to those that are joining us online through the live stream and Zoom. So thank you all for being here. We really do appreciate it. Before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that we're gathered here this evening on the ancestral and traditional lands of the Miami, Potawatomi, Shawnee, Lenape, and other Native peoples of the past and present. We also acknowledge that IUPUI displaced the African-American business and residential neighborhoods of Indiana Avenue and Ransom Place in the 1960s. We honor those who have cared for this place in the past, and we hope sincerely that its current use for the pursuit and sharing of knowledge and understanding, which are goals of the university, will lead to a future that is more equitable and just. Before we get started with this evening's talk, I'd like to share that complimentary parking is made possible this evening by the Great Frame Up of Indianapolis and Carmel. If you're parked in the parking garage, you can get parking validation codes from our gallery team over in this gallery right over here. You're also welcome to visit the galleries. There are 3 galleries in this building. And I'd also like to mention that this evening, following this talk, there will be 2 musical performances related to the Give and Take exhibition featuring acclaimed musicians Han Nebon and Dion Tony Parks, who will perform in response to the exhibition's theme of play. And that'll be happening between 8 and 9 this evening. Now I'm excited to share that this evening's guest lecturer is Dr. Jennifer Field. Dr. Field is the executive director at the estate of David Smith, as well as a curator, author, and art historian. She has held curatorial and research positions at the Museum of Modern Art, the Willem de Kooning Foundation, and De Dona Galleries. We're very honored to have Jennifer here with us this evening, and we're excited to learn more about her curatorial work and the work of the legendary and internationally renowned Hoosier-born sculptor David Smith. So please help me welcome Jennifer Field to the stage. Jennifer.
Thank you, Greg. And thank you, Jason Gross, for getting us set up here tonight. And thank you to Kim Johnson and to everyone at the Herron School of Art and Design for giving me the opportunity to be here this evening. And thank you to the audience, both here in Indianapolis and also joining us online. I hope you'll find tonight to be a colorful and engaging tour through 2 recent exhibitions featuring the work of David Smith. These shows took place only months apart, and they were significantly different from one another. Together, they've provided us with new photography and virtual 3D footage that brings to life the range of Smith's practice. We'll be shifting tonight between PowerPoint and a technology called Matterport, so if there are any lags, please be patient. I'll start with a brief biography on David Smith before moving into a virtual tour of select works in the first exhibition, titled Songs of the Horizon, David Smith, Music and Dance, held at the Hyde Collection in Glens Falls, New York from June 24th to September 17th, 2023, curated by myself. This exhibition featured mostly drawings, paintings, sketches, and sculptures from the 1940s, toward the early part of Smith's career. In honor of Smith's origins in Indiana and the site of tonight's lecture, I will then take a detour to Indiana University, Bloomington, to introduce a body of work Smith made there as a visiting faculty member in 1954. The talk will conclude with a photo walkthrough of the exhibition, No One Thing, David Smith Late Sculptures, organized by the International Art Gallery Hauser and Wirth for their flagship space in the Chelsea district of Manhattan. This show was curated by Alexis Lowry. This was a bold and graphic show of painted sculptures made within the last 5 years of Smith's life, between 1961 and 1964. It opened on February 1st of this year and just closed on Saturday, April 13th. David Smith is recognized as one of the most innovative American artists of the 20th century. He's best known for bringing the industrial technique of welding to the making of sculpture, but he also made many paintings and drawings throughout his life. Smith was born on March 9th, 1906 in Decatur, Indiana, about 2 hours to the northeast of Indianapolis by today's driving conditions. As a teenager, he moved with his family to Paulding, Ohio, just over the state border, then briefly attended Ohio University in the town of Athens in the southeastern part of the state. During his first summer break from college, he worked as a riveter and spot welder at the Studebaker plant in South Bend, Indiana. For historical context, this would have been shortly after Studebaker discontinued manufacture of all horse-drawn vehicles to focus exclusively on automobile production. Smith would later explain the importance of this experience, not only for giving him fundamental welding skills, but also for teaching him how to see how individual abstract parts fit together into a unified functioning whole, similar to the way that he later constructed large metal sculptures from a combination of found and fabricated parts. Smith then enrolled at the University of Notre Dame, but left after a few weeks, returning to Studebaker to work in its finance department. From there, he moved briefly in 1926 to Washington, D.C., and then to New York City, where he declared his intention to become an artist. Soon after Smith moved to New York City, he met the artist Dorothy Daner, who encouraged him to enroll at the Art Students League, a school popular among artists who would later become known as the New York School. Smith and Daner married the following year at the end of 1927. Daner would remain an essential source of support and partnership for Smith over the next 23 years. Smith studied painting and drawing with European modernists, and through friends at the League, met the artist and theorist John Graham. Graham was born in Ukraine and was an important link to Europe for young American artists. In the early 1930s, Smith saw a welded metal sculpture by Pablo Picasso reproduced in a French art journal belonging to Graham. With the welding skills he had acquired at the Studebaker factory, Smith identified in that work a path forward in sculpture making, and he began welding together found metal elements. Throughout his career, he considered drawing, painting, and sculpture to be part of what he called the same work stream. He always considered himself a painter as much as a sculptor, and painting sculptures became a central part of his practice. In the summer of 1929, also through friends at the League, Daner and Smith visited Bolton Landing, a hamlet on Lake George in the foothills of the Adirondack Mountains. By the end of that season, they had purchased an old house and outbuilding on 86 acres of land. It was a rustic existence, and eventually they built a new house, and Smith erected buildings for his art practice, one for sculpture, which he called the shop, and one for painting. In 1940, Smith and Daner moved to Bolton Landing full-time. For those of you who may be less familiar with the geography of New York State, the Adirondack Park, which can be seen here in the top part of what's roughly a triangle, is a National Historic Landmark comprising 6 million acres of mountain land. It is the largest publicly protected area in the 48 contiguous United States, and larger than Yellowstone, Yosemite, the Grand Canyon, Glacier National Park, and the Great Smokies combined. This is where David Smith made his home for 25 years, while he established a reputation as one of the foremost artists of the abstract expressionist generation. And to give you a sense of where exactly Lake George is, New York City is here. Lake George, right around here. This is Albany, the capital. In 1950, Daner left Smith and returned to New York City, but Smith would live in Bolton Landing for the rest of his life. His sculpture became larger and larger, and he would arrange it in the fields around his home, in rows or in family groups. He routinely photographed them, both for documentation and, the scholar Sarah Hamill has argued, to study their spatial relationships through an alternative flat medium. Sometimes Smith would transport sculptures to the town dock on Lake George, where he would photograph them against the water and the hills on the opposing shore. In these surroundings, nature became a crucial element in Smith's consideration of his work. We've been looking at a lot of black and white images, so here's a color slide to give you an indication of the vibrancy of Smith's later work during the summer months. This photograph was taken by Smith around the pond that he constructed on his property. As his sculpture proliferated, the fields at Bolton Landing became famous and ultimately the inspiration behind many well-known contemporary sculpture parks. Smith died in a car accident near Bennington, Vermont in May 1965 on his way to an exhibition opening at Bennington College from the home of his friend, the painter Kenneth Noland. And from here, we're going to start the Matterport tour of the Hyde Collection exhibition. So this is a great technology. It's mapped the three-dimensional space of the exhibition in the hope that you'll have a sense of how it was installed and get a sense of what it was like to be in the space. The exhibition, as you can see, was called Songs of the Horizon, David Smith Music and Dance. Due to the importance of place in Smith's practice, the exhibition at the Hyde Collection in Glens Falls was significant for the estate of David Smith as well as for the local community. Glens Falls is located about 20 minutes from where Smith lived, at the gateway to the Adirondack Park. From the start, the museum and the estate envisioned this exhibition as a celebration of the inspiration that Smith drew from the landscape of the area and from performing artists who lived there. It was also intended as a celebration of a broader artistic legacy there, centered around music and dance. Today, the region is home to the Glens Falls Symphony, the Marcella Sembrick Opera Museum, the National Museum of Dance, and the Saratoga Performing Arts Center. The title of the exhibition, Songs of the Horizon, David Smith Music and Dance, came from Smith himself. In early 1950, as he was waiting for a response to his application for a John Simon Guggenheim Fellowship to support his artistic practice, Smith wrote some notes, a poem really, that we call Sculpture Hopes to Be. By this time, he had lived full-time in Bolton Landing for 10 years. And in these notes, he began to outline his ideas for sculpture in relation to nature, separate from it, but in dialogue with it. He described, quote, a structure that can face the sun, solids that are always changing, the ceaseless state of evolving, and the song that ever sings of the horizon, end quote. This statement records one of Smith's earliest references to music and movement. Music and dance were important influences in his life and work, and the phrase Songs of the Horizon seemed to perfectly encapsulate these interests, along with the primary role that nature and landscape played in Smith's approach to art making. So, Greg, if we could scroll over to the right. There's a painting here that opened the exhibition. This is an untitled work, but it has a parenthetical title, Piat, capital P-I-A-T, period. This was done in 1946. In Bolton Landing, Smith and Daner found a strong avant-garde performing arts community that was consonant with their own progressive social values. We know from the inscription on this painting, Piat, which you can see in the upper center, that Smith is referencing the renowned cellist Gregor Piatigorsky, who escaped the Soviet Union under Lenin and then fled Europe altogether 4 days after World War II broke out in 1939. Piatigorsky had previously toured the United States and put a deposit on a house in Elizabethtown, about an hour north of Bolton Landing in the High Peaks region of the Adirondacks. He taught at the Curtis Institute of Music in Philadelphia and at Tanglewood, Boston University's summer campus in the Berkshires in Massachusetts. I hung this painting near the entrance of the exhibition because it demonstrates in a robust way Smith's inventive translation of actual historical figures into compositions that symbolically represent their creative livelihoods, as well as his own connections to music, dance, and the landscape. In this work, if you look in the lower right, you'll find that he enlarged the bridges of 3 small cellos at the bottom of the composition and added architectural details, transforming them into towers and cables, recalling suspension bridges found around Manhattan. The contours of the player's arm and shoulder here, floating among clouds, suggest the silhouette of a mountain range. Music notes and staffs have taken the place of facial features, elements that perhaps symbolize the consuming passion and concentration of a dedicated musician. So this is a niche in the installation that featured a selection of 4 early landscapes by Smith and by Daner. They were intended to establish a sense of place and the significance that Bolton Landing and the surrounding region had for both artists. The 2 landscapes by Smith are both dated 1930, and they're among the earliest existing paintings by him. In these works, such as this one, I feel as though Smith is really absorbing the landscape, studying it. The peaks, the farmland, and sometimes a glimpse of Lake George can be seen in these early works. So Greg, if you swing around to the right a little bit, that's a work. Yeah, so there's another painting by Smith from 1930, and there you can see a glimpse of the lake. It looks different today. The trees have grown up and it's less farm country. And then, yes, we're gonna go 3 drawings shown over a case that featured some archival materials in the show, sketches, some booklets, facsimiles of sketchbook pages, photographs, the added texture. And we're going to focus on these 3 drawings. Daner had studied dance, and she exposed Smith to some of the most influential trends in modern choreography. One of their first outings as a married couple was to a performance by the American modern dance pioneer Martha Graham. Smith made these studies of Graham after photographs by Barbara Morgan published in 1941. Morgan's photos, and it may be argued, Graham's choreography itself, were compatible with Smith's growing interest in the 1940s in surrealist iconography involving metamorphosis, sex, and death. In the 1930 dance Lamentation, which is depicted in the drawing on the left, the dancer's body moves through a series of mostly seated poses while constricted by a narrow jersey tube. Graham described the encasement as a metaphor for, quote, tragedy that obsesses the body, the ability to stretch inside your own skin, to witness and test the perimeters and boundaries of grief, end quote. The drawing on the far right had been shown once before in 1985, but the others, to our knowledge, had not been seen in public before. So this was the first time that this suite of drawings was brought together for this show. If we swing around, there is a sculpture that I considered to be the keystone of this show on the pedestal here. This is called Boaz Dancing School. It's made of steel and it's from 1945. In 1944, Francisca Boaz, a progressive New York City-based choreographer and percussionist, opened a summer dance school in Bolton Landing. Her studio would become the subject of this sculpture, Boaz Dancing School. Boaz believed that the arts could foster social change. She was openly gay and her school was racially integrated, which were radical acts at the time. She engaged the local community by inviting the public to observe Friday evening classes. The school's presence was significant to both Smith and Daner, who shared Boaz's social and political values. Boaz was the daughter of revolutionary cultural anthropologist Franz Boas, whom Smith read. Accordingly, Francisca Boaz employed percussion instruments from other continents and cultures in her classes. In Boaz Dancing School, maybe we can look at it from the side if that's possible. Smith employed single point perspective that we see in painting and drawing to sculptural form. Smith, who had trained as a painter, described the evolution of his sculpture as, quote, constructions leaving the canvas, end quote. The canvas became the base, a logic made manifest in this work. The studio floor narrows upward, while dancers correspondingly decrease in size. There we go. Actually, there you go. That's a good shot. Yeah, there you go. So you can see on the far left, there's a large crouching figure on the floor, and then smaller sculptures up at the bar on the right. The space is penetrable with an open construction and a vertical stack of disembodied eyes on the far side behind this dancer we see here. Can everyone see those? Right here. Yes, exactly. According to Boaz's partner, Jan Gay, the eyes signify the presence of spectators peering in wide-eyed at the scene taking place inside. Subjected to the external gaze, the arrangement takes on a stage-like quality, something that we'll see in later works in this show. Now we're going to jump to the sculpture that's directly behind this one in this shot. This is Hello Player. Maybe come around to the left a little bit. So we can... Oh, that's great. So the sculpture is titled Cello Player. It's made of steel and paint on a wood base made by Smith. It's from 1946. And this is presumably the end result of the more romantic painted study of Gregor Piatigorsky that we saw at the beginning of the installation. It was shown near a painting to the left. Sorry, Greg, I'm making you jump around, but here you go. Yeah, that painting, which was on loan from the Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art in Bentonville, Arkansas. And here in this painting, you can see that the shoulders, if you think back to that portrait of Piatigorsky, the shoulders that were mountains have now also become the strings of an instrument. Smith rendered the figure of the cello player here into a delineated system of geometric shapes with gradation to convey volume in a manner that, compared to the dreamlike portrait, more readily translates to a three-dimensional object in real space. We go back to the sculpture. Oh, this is good. The sculpture is remarkably faithful to that painting. The musician and cello are now an insect-like unit with jutting elbows and switchbacks resembling the saltatorial limbs of a grasshopper. In place of a head, the outline of a music stand frames a dense array of music notes, bars, and rests. This is actually a good place to scroll over to that drawing on the right. Yeah, that's great. We're going to take a look now at some musicians at keyboards and dancers. This drawing depicts Sylvia Marlowe, a classically trained pianist who considered the harpsichord to be, quote, a vehicle for modern music and even swing, end quote. Her image triggered for Smith an inventive group of works with hands that look like they could crawl off the paper, or harpsichordists connected to their instruments by lines projecting from her hands and mouth, like a web, as in this work. Greg, could we go to Adagio Dancer, the little green sculpture? Yep, back in that direction. Yes. The mantis-like figure of Sylvia Marlowe seen in the drawing is echoed in this intimate jewel-like sculpture titled Adagio Dancer. The biomorphism could also be said to resemble an unfurling bud or leaves, an illusion enhanced by the sculpture's bright green patina. This protean aspect of Smith's sculpture as it emerged in the 1940s would become a defining characteristic of his mature work. So these three paintings on paper were made on the theme of euterpe and terpsichore, the ancient Greek muses of music and dance. These were all made in 1946. The figure seated at the keyboard is a further abstracted version of the portrait of Sylvia Marlowe hunched over the harpsichord that we just saw. Smith has now added a dancer on the left. The backdrops shift between a burgundy spotlit stage with ghost-like outlines of other performers. You can see that one here on the right. A flatter setting in rose and green with a linear diagram of the performers floating in the upper right, in the middle. And on the left, a brushy gray atmosphere in which the performers appear to be hovering in space. So the one on the left is probably the most simplified. We don't know which order these were painted in. But if we think about translation into a sculptural form, we can see how a work like this one could eventually become a sculpture like the one you're about to see now. So this is a sculpture called Euterpe and Terpsichore. Smith created a brilliant sheen on this work by use of an electric grinder on sheets of silicon bronze welded together. He would later apply this finish to his famous stainless steel cubi series so that they would reflect the sky or the sun or the green of the mountains, and the color of the environment became infused with the surface of the sculpture. He gave Terpsichore and Euterpe, on the other hand, which is the sculpture you see on the left, a green patina like we sometimes see in ancient bronzes or aged copper, a nod to his lifelong interest in antiquity. Greg, could we zoom in on that one? That's great. Just to give people a chance to see it a little more closely. And then from here, I'd like to go to the small painting on the far right. Yes. This painting measures only 7 1/8 by 9.5 inches, but it has a really big presence. Here, the musician, dancer, and instrument perform on a black and white keyboard that recedes into a distant mountain range. Into this fantastical scene, Smith has integrated a landscape, a mountain landscape, like the one surrounding his home in Bolton Landing. There are two works shown here, this one and a print on the side on the left. These works are both by Dorothy Daner. It was important to acknowledge her influence in this show. These are later works. Daner became an accomplished sculptor in her own right after 1955. This work is called Low Landscape Sideways from 1962, and it reveals the importance of landscape to Daner even after she left Bolton Landing. She also became an accomplished printmaker. The colored etching and aquatint on the left was made in 1953 at Atelier 17, a well-known print workshop established by Stanley William Hayter, first in Paris and then in New York. This is the last slide from the galleries that I'll show you. Egyptian landscape was made in 1951. And while it doesn't directly relate to music and dance, it was included in the exhibition as a reconciliation of Smith's longstanding interests in myth, ancient cultures, and landscape, expressed through surrealist biomorphism. It bridges Smith's surrealist-inspired work of the 1940s and sculptures such as his renowned drawing and space work, Hudson River Landscape, in the collection of the Whitney Museum, which he made the same year. Now, before we exit the galleries in this exhibition altogether, there's an outside work from 1959, so it departs from the chronology of this exhibition and from this direct theme, but it's a large work made in stainless steel called Sentinel 5. And this work was included as an example of Smith's later work that can go outside, which he intended to go outside. And we wanted to honor that relationship between his sculptures and the natural landscape that was so important to him. And what was really great, when this sculpture was installed, we started to see echoes of the forms of the works that we saw from inside the galleries. So even though this is an abstract, very geometric work, the way that those thin legs at the bottom of the sculpture are sort of posed one in front of the other, and the way that the head, if you think of this as an abstracted figure, turns up, it became very kind of poetic and reminiscent of the more figural works that we saw in the core exhibition. Smith did receive the John Simon Guggenheim Fellowship in 1950, and he received another one in 1951. This gave him the financial security he needed to stop taking other jobs and devote himself full-time to art making. His sculptures became larger and more abstract, and as he began arranging them outside his studio, the relationship with nature became an intrinsic element in his work. Before I move on to the exhibition at Hauser and Wirth, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge an important year in Smith's career that took place here in Indiana in 1954. After fulfilling a commitment as a visiting professor at the University of Arkansas in 1953, Smith and his second wife, Jean Fries, stopped on the way home to Bolton Landing in Bloomington, Indiana, to visit Smith's friend, George Rickey, and his wife, Edith. Rickey was a member of the faculty at Indiana University and remained the closest friend Smith had there when Smith moved to Bloomington the following year for an 8-month job teaching sculpture. And in this slide on the right, this is George Rickey. Smith had a large studio with the school's forge located just outside. In early 1955, he began a series of 11 narrow vertical sculptures that he would call the forgings. For these works, Smith used a power forge, a method that relies on a heavy hammer to shape metal using compression force. You can see forging 4 shown on the far left here at Newfields here in Indianapolis, where it has been on long-term loan from the estate for many years. For the forgings, Smith relied on the assistance of a local blacksmith named Leroy Borton. In a letter to the art historian Sam Hunter, Smith described their relationship as follows, quote, "His interest in my work was more than that of the subcontracting man and machine. He was an excellent craftsman developed in the old school of hard forging, tempering of chisels, wagon repair, etc. In the days we worked together, we became friendly, talking of metalworking methods, etc." End quote. This photo, which presumably depicts Borton leading a tutorial on forging, not power forging, was first published in 2022, so only a couple of years ago, in an article on Smith and Borton by Douglas Wissing for the Indiana Historical Society's journal, Traces of Indiana and Midwest History. And here we see David Smith, or as close as he can get to Borton, watching the process. Smith named a sculpture made in 1956 in honor of Borton. It was acquired by the Museum of Modern Art the following year and remains a core work in the museum's regular abstract expressionist galleries. A few months after the closing of Songs of the Horizon, David Smith Music and Dance at the Hyde Collection, Hauser and Wirth opened the exhibition No One Thing, David Smith Late Sculptures. The identity of this exhibition was markedly different than the Hyde Collection show, which was based on a historical narrative and featured semi-representational works mainly from the 1940s. By contrast, No One Thing was conceived as an opportunity to showcase a select group of major painted sculptures made in the last 5 years of Smith's life between 1961 and 1964. I didn't realize until this exhibition had been open for several weeks just how unfamiliar Smith's painted abstract sculptures are to the public. Many people associate Smith with series such as the Cube Eyes, which he made between 1961 and 1965. These are the sculptures that are most frequently illustrated in art history textbooks and receive the most visibility. Not this style of work, which is flat, colorful, and whimsical. Rebecca's circle has the appearance of a child's painting of a flower cut out of paper. This sculpture, which was made in 1961, was not seen in public until 1997, when it was included in the exhibition The Fields of David Smith at Storm King Arts Center, a 500-acre sculpture park about an hour north of New York City. This work is titled after Smith's eldest daughter, who would have been around 7 years old at the time he made it. Smith incorporated the names of his daughters, Rebecca and Candida, into many of his sculptures, in their titles or as inscriptions that he welded onto the actual works. After Smith and Jean Fries divorced, he saw his children primarily during summers and on holidays. His art became a means of connecting with them. Rebecca's circle stands 7 feet tall. Its surface is characterized by the loose, brushy application of bold hues. The side you see here resembles a sunflower, partially cloaked in shadow. Its centered disc, stem, and leaf are painted black, and it has a green base with an irregular hard-edged black shape, as if the sun is casting shadow on surrounding grass. The petals are white, red, and green. The other side of the work, however, is very different. Here, Smith has applied bright yellow and green, also with expressionistic brushwork, but with color that evokes a landscape by Van Gogh. This work is called 90 Sun, and it was made the same year as another similar sculpture called 90 Father, the taller work you see here. Both works are defined by round heads made of boiler tank ends, a common element for Smith, set on slender trunks and painted with shimmering expressionistic brushwork. Smith emphasized the fundamental humanoid qualities of these works by photographing himself alongside them, like an attendee at a family reunion. As you can see, 90 Sun is almost exactly Smith's height. This sculpture is surprisingly complex. It's an untitled work, and it's impossible to grasp its form all at once. As we walk around it, planar sections seem to appear, disappear, and reappear depending on the viewer's position. The circular cutouts alternately frame the space behind them or become invisible to the eye. This is the protean aspect of Smith's work that I mentioned earlier. The art historian and early Smith scholar Rosalind Krauss would refer to this trait in Smith's sculpture as, quote, elusiveness, unquote. It set him apart from other sculptors who employed carving or bronze casting to produce objects in the round and which mimic the way human form occupies space. In classic statuary, we can anticipate the whole form by looking at it from 1 or 2 vantage points. Smith's sculptures can look like entirely different works, depending on the viewer's angle. Krauss described this experience as follows, quote, "The sculpture does not appear whole and complete. We cannot run our fingers around it to trace its contours and define its shape. We have only a visual display of surfaces slipping past one another, throwing each other into relief. We cannot grasp it imaginatively," end quote. In this way, Smith revolutionized expectations of sculptural form and how it functions in space. Another work in this exhibition that exemplifies this elusive quality is Zig 1. Zig 1 is part of a series of sculptures called the Zigs that Smith made between 1961 and 1964. The name is a shortened form of the term ziggurat, which refers to a stepped architectural structure found in ancient Mesopotamia. Standing over 8 feet high, the body of the sculpture, if I can call it a body, is constructed from halved cylinders to create a dynamic rhythm of concave and convex passages. In the last 5 years of his life, Smith's work became more geometrically abstract. My favorite element here is this sneaky little concave segment that Smith welded onto the lower left of the widest tubing. From the side, it becomes clear that this element is supporting the entire structure because welded to it is this thin and rather simple leg that props up that whole side. From the side, Zig 1 resembles a person with a walking stick, while the widest angles confront the viewer like an open-armed giant. To unify all parts, Smith applied by hand abstract expressionistic brushstrokes of black paint over a rust-colored ground. Smith took photographs throughout his life, and people have likened this sculpture to the adjustable rings and dials of a camera. Circles intercepted certainly resembles a portal or a lens of some kind that can frame other sculptures around it, or the landscape. It has also been likened to the circle paintings that Smith's friend Kenneth Noland had recently begun, and which would become his signature feature. One person asked me if this sculpture was made of wood due to the way the paint sits on the surface of these rings, but it's entirely made of steel. One crucial aspect of these sculptures is that they straddle the appearance of handmade objects and fabricated objects. I believe that Smith courted this tension. If we look closely at the rings and circles intercepted, which Smith cut himself, we can see irregularities such as overcuts and jagged edges. And I don't know if everyone can see this, but there's a little element here. And you can see it in the white untitled work and in many sculptures if you look very closely. From a distance, elements can look manufactured, but up close we see evidence of the artist's involvement, not only in the brushwork, but also in the details of the shapes, cavities, and welds. As in Rebecca's circle, the sculpture that looks like a flower, circles intercepted is asymmetrical. The colors on each side are different from one another. On this tab, I suppose is the interception, Smith used welds to write his signature and date he finished the work. He did this on nearly all the sculptures in the exhibition. Primo Piano 2 is one of 3 white sculptures named Primo Piano, which in Italian means first floor. In Europe, this means the floor above the ground floor. In other words, what we in the US would call the second floor. The sculpture is about 13.5 feet wide. It barely fit in the gallery's freight elevator. When Smith made this work, he had recently returned from a month in Italy, where he had been invited to make 2 sculptures for an exhibition associated with an event called the Festival of Two Worlds in Spoleto. As a workspace, he was given a large abandoned steel factory in the town of Voltri outside Genoa, and a team of metalworkers to assist him. He found these conditions to be so favorable and inspiring that instead of 2 sculptures, he made 27 sculptures within the month. He named these works Voltris after the location where they were made. He also sent back from Voltri materials and elements to Bolton Landing, where he made an additional 15 sculptures that he called Voltri Boltons or Boltons. Fortified by this success, when he returned to Bolton Landing, he began an accelerated campaign of sculpture making that included the Primo Piano series. Smith's younger daughter, Candida, remembers that at this time, the number of sculptures in the fields began to multiply at an amazing rate. And I don't see any of the Primo Pianos here, but we do see this untitled work that we just looked at a few minutes ago. Smith described the Primo Piano as the floor where most of the action takes place. In this work, if we consider the long horizontal beam to be the floor, the action is taking place above it in a dynamic interplay of different shapes and metals. We see bisected tubing like that used in Zig 1, along with a teardrop shape made of bronze and a flat plane of stainless steel that reflects the sky. In the exhibition, this was shown near a window, closed here, but left open through most of the exhibition, so that the light coming in would bounce off of that plane. The rest of the sculpture is steel painted white. The mixing of metals was uncommon in sculpture at the time, and it still is. They add textural and tonal complexity to this work, and they challenge notions of purity in art. The last sculpture I'm going to discuss tonight is called Gondola 2. I regret I don't have better images. The purple color on the right side of this sculpture, what you see here is actually here, is really hard to capture in photography. It's not quite as bright as the shot you see on the right, but it's not as dark as the one on the left. It's somewhere in between. And it's absolutely gorgeous. This is one of my favorite sculptures. The title of this work refers to a gondola found in a factory, a hoist that runs along tracks on the ceiling and transports heavy materials and equipment from one area to another. Smith is not referring to a gondola such as we would see in Venice. This work measures just over 9 feet tall and 9 feet wide. It is painted in black, cream, and dusky purple tones, and it's the last sculpture Smith is known to have painted. I love the precarious compositional balance of this work, the way that the whole sculpture is slightly asymmetrical and attached in the middle with these big bolts. Smith called the shapes on either side cloud ends. They come from the process of rolling out steel into plates, which leaves uneven ends that are then cut, like dough when it's rolled out with a rolling pin. He loved this shape and said he could make 100 more sculptures with them and never tire of it. They contribute to a sense of weightlessness that counteracts the central I-beam and the heavy steel of the work. Gondola 2 belongs to a group of polychromatic sculptures that includes Gondola, made in 1961, and Dita Gondola, made in 1964, after his daughter Candida. Smith began the gondolas partly in response to painter Robert Motherwell's renowned series of painted elegies to the Spanish Republic, which Motherwell produced between 1948 and 1973 as belated lamentations for the Spanish Civil War, fought between 1936 and 1939. Smith and Motherwell were close friends. Motherwell would later recall, "Several times David said to me," this is a quote, "that I should make an elegy sculpture. He said he would show me how, help me make it, everything. But I didn't do it because I could never imagine what an elegy would look like from the side." Clearly, even Motherwell was unaccustomed to Smith's ability to conceive sculptures of varying depths, including a remarkable flatness that we see in Rebecca's Circle or Gondola 2, especially for sculptures of that size. I will stop here with a brief conclusion that Smith departed from sculptural conventions based on lifelike volumetric principles, conflating the nature of sculpture as a freestanding object with the typically flat characteristics of a painting, while maintaining a heightened sensitivity to the surrounding environment. His sculptures establish a site of dialogue with his children, with his peers, and with the effects of nature. Thank you for your time and attention. And I think we have time for some questions if anyone has any from the audience. Yes, Holly. Yes.
I was wondering in the painted sculptures, were those ever shown before he died, or were they always just in his estate? Because I know that they were controversial because they were painted.
Yes, they were shown. Not all of them, but most of them were shown. The zigs, for example, which are all painted, he showed those very early, right after they were finished, and actually won a prize, the Carnegie Museum Purchase Prize for one of them. So they were shown. I think what happens is with art history, after an artist's death, people sort of hone in on one iconic branch of their practice, and that becomes the defining body of work for that artist.
Since you just mentioned that he was known for his sculpture, but he considered himself a painter and did drawings and everything else. Was he bothered by the fact that his paintings maybe didn't get as much recognition as his three-dimensional work?
I don't think he was bothered that his paintings didn't receive as much recognition. He continued to make paintings throughout his career. Just a brief survey, doing some very modernist, cubist type paintings as a student. He did some surrealist paintings. He did a body of work in the late 50s called The Sprays, which was one of the first, if not the earliest use of commercial spray enamel in fine art, where he would lay down objects on a sheet of paper or canvas and spray around them, sometimes go back and hand paint them. And then he did a series of poured enamel nude figures later in life. So he was working very figurally on canvas at the same time he was making abstract sculptures like this. But his largest body of work is drawings, works on paper. And during his lifetime, Smith exhibited works on paper alongside his sculptures in many exhibitions. We still learn about drawings that are out in the world that were sold during his lifetime or that he gave away to friends and collectors during his life. So the drawings really were a very active part of his practice and of his exhibition history prior to his death.
I appreciate you coming. This is a fantastic way to spend a Wednesday evening. Do you think that his Smith's ability to take pictures of his work or be photographed helped with his popularity? Life magazine, it seemed pretty forward thinking at the time. And I often talk about that with my students about how much we photograph our work and we're bombarded with images, but it seems quite new. Can you talk about that a little bit, please?
I'm glad you tell your students to photograph their work. I think it's really important that an artist document their own practice. We are very fortunate at the estate that Smith took photographs of all of his sculptures. He did this, yes, to market the work himself and to control the presentation of it. Bolton Landing is located about 5.5 hours north of New York City today. So at the time Smith lived there, it would have taken even longer to drive up and back. And he had gallery representation in New York City. He needed a way to send images to his dealer of works that he had recently completed so that she could organize exhibitions and show them to potential collectors. So he absolutely was using photography in that way. Some of the photographs that you see in early exhibition catalogs and brochures were taken by Smith himself. And in the archive, we have his photos, and sometimes they're marked up by hand, and you can see where he wanted them to be cropped, how he modified them for publication. Other times, like I mentioned, he would photograph them for his own use, it seems, and arrange them in family groups, put them in his truck, bring them down to the town dock, photograph them against the lake. He would shoot works from certain series together, but not exclusively. He would mix in different types of works within those series. So he was always looking at the way that these shapes and forms interacted with one another and was able to survey them from the top of his hill near his home in Bolton Landing as he arranged them in the fields. But yes, to answer your question, he did use them for his own promotion. Right. Yes, Greg.
So you've seen this work in person. It's really dynamic to get to see it in 3 dimensions and to move around it. When is I believe Meyer Garden is going to be another destination, correct? In Michigan?
Yes, very good point. So it's recently been announced. Thank you for bringing that up. There's going to be an exhibition in Grand Rapids at the Frederick Meyer Garden and Sculpture Park. So not too far away. And it's going to be a really excellent exhibition that exhibits a range of Smith's practice, paintings, drawings, and sculptures that are related to nature in lots of different ways. So when we discuss Smith historically, we know about Bolton Landing, we know about how he placed the sculptures in the fields and photographed them, moved them around. People came to know the fields, they would drive by. They were the inspiration for many sculpture parks. But he also, before he started welding, made sculpted constructions using found natural elements like coral, wood. And so it will be looking at his work using those natural elements as well. There's some drawings that we call at the estate birds in flight, because it looks like scratchy, very frenetic ink marks that sort of mimic a frenzied flock of birds in maybe the Adirondack sky. So it's looking at his work in relation to nature from many different angles, and it will be accompanied by an exhibition catalog with curators and artists commenting on the work. So I strongly encourage you to go see it. That opens in September of 2024. And there will also be a selection of 4 outdoor sculptures exhibited on their rooftop off of their indoor exhibition space. So that would be a good field trip. The curator of that show is Suzanne Remiak, who's the chief curator at the mine. Yes.
As far as I'm understanding about this current show here, they don't have much of his drawings or his 2D work, it appears to be. Why was it vital to you to have both his paintings, drawings, and sculptures all together?
In the first exhibition,
Yes, in yours.
the first exhibition was centered around a theme, and it was a more narrative exhibition, looking at specific people in the region who inspired him. We're able to identify many of the subjects of those works, or we're at the origins of those works. And Smith was acknowledging those people and drawing inspiration of them, and realizing that in many different mediums. As his work became larger and more abstract, those references are less literal. And this exhibition was conceived as a chance to showcase a body of sculpture that is lesser known to the general public, but which was still incredibly important to him. So just 2 different shows with very different identities.
Any other questions? Thank you all for coming. And Jennifer, thank you so much.
Thank you, Greg.